Ladies and gentlemen, kiss your monitors. I'm online. Glad to welcome you. Today we're going to talk about mastering. This whole mastering thing really worries a lot of people, not just beginners, but also producers, arrangers, beat makers, basically everyone involved with music. Because it's a pretty secretive stage, and it's not really arranging. We're not making music at this point. It's not really mixing either, although everything we use in mixing, all the tools, are actually used in mastering too. So why is it separated out into its own category, its own stage, which ideally is done by a different person who knows everything a mixing engineer knows, and vice versa, a mixing engineer knows how to master, but still, they often hand off the mastering to someone who is specifically specialized in mastering. So what's the deal with that, right? Let's start from the very beginning. So, a lot of people ask me, does this mean we need to mix something like? We used to mix track by track, but now we're mixing a single track, meaning the whole song. Is that how it works? I want to warn you right away against thinking that. Mastering is kind of like mixing on a single track, but it's not actually mixing on a single track. It's a completely different story, with a different philosophy and a different core idea. A lot of people probably expect me to start breaking down some kind of processing chain, like first you put on a compressor, then an equalizer, then maybe a saturator, and so on, and that's how it's done. No, that's all nonsense, because your mix is unique. It might not need a compressor at all. It might not need any crazy, excessive EQing. Sometimes, just putting a limiter on it and boosting the volume up to match your reference tracks is enough. That might be all you need to do, because one of the main ideas behind mastering is that you're already getting a quality mix at this stage. It's already mixed. It's already just. It's hard to find any faults with it, so why do you even need it in that case? Anyway, let's start with the old school stuff, okay? When did all this begin? Back in the day, people usually recorded albums. Now that whole thing is kind of fading away. Everyone just releases singles now, but back then, it was all about albums. And so, imagine a situation where all your tracks are high quality, they're all well mixed, and let's say, okay, their volume levels are already matched. But when you switch from one track to another, somehow the overall atmosphere gets lost, the vibe disappears, and there's a break in the concept or the overall idea of the album. It's really hard to imagine for those who aren't very experienced, so I'm going to use some analogies now. Imagine you have a photo album. Let's say it has photos of a person, and the photographer took them in a very artistic, high-quality way. Then they were retouched. Everything looks just perfect. But it's just one photo. It's black and white, but it's high quality. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's a signature black and white shot. Another photo is in the style of the 60s, kind of like Vogue vintage. It's in color, but you can really see that pin-up vibe in it. Let's put it that way. There's a photo in the spirit of. Like, really, it's super detailed. You can see absolutely everything. If you zoom in, you could probably spot microbes on it. And the background behind her is blurred out. It's shot on a modern DSLR with a billion megapixels, so to speak. Everything's great. Everything's high quality. So, if you look at this photo by itself, it's perfect. But within the context of the album, we feel something unnatural, some inconsistency. So what's going on here? This is exactly a question about the overall concept. Still, the different tracks more or less had a scene connecting them. It's like they're standing there holding hands, even though they have different keys, different tempos, different sounds used in them. And that's the first reason why mastering engineers appeared in the first place. There was also this really archaic era when mastering itself emerged just so that there was a certain standard for how to release a track on vinyl. For example, if it had too much bass, the needle would just jump out. But we're not touching on that topic. We're skipping ahead a bit. So, when we have an album and stories, right? And maybe you've noticed this too, or pay attention next time, when you pick up, say, a collection of New Year's songs, there are some like that. There are all sorts of different songs in there, but they all sound like they came off the same assembly line. Even though these are totally different bands, with different producers working on them. So why is that? It's because the people who put together the compilation do a general mastering for all the tracks. and that gives them a certain overall vibe. I'll be repeating the word overall a lot, because this sense of unity and the way your tracks fit together with others in your genre is really important. You could say this is a really central idea. Right now, I'm not talking about loudness, I'm talking about the color or tone. And here's where it gets tricky. This is why mastering is so difficult, and why it's usually handed over to dedicated specialists, especially in high-end professional productions. Because you have to manage to make the track blend with the neighboring tracks without ruining it, whether it's in an album or a compilation. That's exactly why labels require that the track you send them is mixed, but not mastered. They do the mastering themselves, because that sense of unity is important to them. It's like, imagine there's a stool, and the stool is originally made out of wood. Let's say it was made by the arranger. It's glued together, mixed, so that it has some little notches or details to make it look unique. This is done by the mixing engineer. And then, to make this stool look similar to other stools in the same genre, they either varnish it or do something else to it. I don't really know the details. They might make it more, let's say, similar in color to another one. Or imagine a painting. It's already finished. It's a work of art. It's beautiful. But when it's in a museum, for some reason they all have the same kind of frame, right? They're all in the same style. You don't see one painting with one kind of frame and another with a different one. That would look kind of strange, honestly. So, that's kind of the idea behind mastering. The reason I'm explaining all this to you is because once you understand this main idea I'm talking about, it'll be easier for you to actually do mastering yourself. Or you might even decide to skip the whole idea of doing mastering on your own, which honestly isn't a bad thing and, in some ways, is actually the right choice. And that's actually much more useful than just looking at some processing chains, because understanding how it's done and why it's done, that's the most important part of this whole thing. So, let's say, okay, we've realized that this is all about album-related stuff or compilation stories, like when a label releases them on their own. What else is important here? Here, it's really important to have a slightly different perspective on the track, not the same as a mixing engineer's. Because how does a mixing engineer's process usually go? For a long time while working on the track, he hears rough stems and unbalanced mixes. And only after that does he turn it into something more or less palatable. 6 hours go by, and then he mixes the track, and it becomes normal. A mastering engineer, on the other hand, works with a much more frequent and dense flow. That is, he gets already professionally mixed tracks. He never listens to any crap. He always gets material from good sound engineers, so he has, let's say, a slightly more accurate reference memory in his head for how a track should generally sound within modern standards and a specific genre. Plus, considering that mastering doesn't take 6 hours, it's done much faster by mastering engineers. He works like an assembly line, an hour of work, the track is done, another hour, another track, and so on. This creates a slightly different mindset in this regard. I'm not even touching on the fact that a mastering engineer, over the years, gets used to listening to a track as a whole. In other words, he listens to it without mentally breaking it down into instruments, like a mixing engineer is used to doing. So it's a slightly different way of thinking, which allows you to look at a track from a different angle. Let me give you an example and you'll understand everything. Let's say you've been mixing a track for a long time, putting in a lot of effort, using good monitors. In a decent room, everything seems fine. You've mixed it well. Then you upload it somewhere, put on some regular headphones, like AirPods, and go for a walk in the park with that track. And suddenly, you listen to someone else's music first, then switch to your own. And you're surprised by how many flaws you managed to find in your own mix, even though you thought you mixed everything just fine, did everything right. Why does this happen? Because you've changed your environment. Because when you're walking somewhere in the park or, let's say, listening to your work or someone else's a bit more detached, you finally listen to the track as a whole. This is pretty much the kind of habit a mastering engineer has. So, why do you notice these flaws? Because you're already looking at it as a mastering engineer. And this trick, it's been known for quite a while. People caught on to it. That's why, during mastering, the mastering engineer often tweaks the mix a bit, making it higher quality. Because from his own perspective, you could say, he sees it differently. He has a more comparative, let's say, reference-based memory. He just goes through more tracks, and he fixes those mistakes. So overall, yes, you could say that mastering does improve the quality, even though that's not its main purpose. The main idea, as we've already discussed, is consistency. Let's talk more about consistency, because right now, we're in a time when albums aren't really being released much. Everything is coming out as singles these days, so why bother with mastering in that case, and why put effort into it? Here's the thing, it may seem like it's all about singles, but nowadays we're in the era of big data, where services recommend similar music to you, and most likely it's going to be in your genre. Basically, these recommendations are based on a taste matrix. How many times tracks are listened to by people who have similar albums to yours? If you sound high quality and your mix is good, but on average you somehow stand out from your genre, for example, if your highs are way too bright, it's not necessarily good or bad, but you just don't fit in with your neighbors, your peers, your competitors, or however else you want to call them. And for a listener who's just strolling through the park, skipping through a playlist like that, it might throw them off a bit, even though, subjectively, everything sounds fine overall and there aren't any obvious mistakes. So, this is also about mastering, about consistency, so that you can, roughly speaking, line up your track alongside other good works like yours, and it doesn't end up being the odd one out. Because, you know, the duckling isn't really ugly, it's just a different kind, right? But it stands out, and that's why it becomes the ugly one. So mastering is about making sure you don't stand out, even though, you know, the duckling isn't a swan, let's say, but it's still a quality animal, right? I mean, it's evolved in its own way. Maybe it even has its own advantages. It's the same thing here. You might have a great track, but if it doesn't fit in, it's already, so to speak, judged by its appearance in a different way. That's exactly the issue mastering solves. That's if we don't even touch its loudness capabilities, or its potential for a bit of quality refinement. This is its first and main idea, really. Next, to do mastering well, the first question you need to ask yourself is this. Why are you doing it? Because where you direct your focus matters, since we already have, like, 3 main ideas. Loudness, catching mistakes that you can't go back and fix because you only have the multitrack, and sometimes you can't even access the multitrack anymore. You're left with just the final mix. That's it. That happens. And you have to work with that. So you ask yourself a question. Is there something here that's an obvious mistake? It's actually pretty hard to spot, because someone has already put effort into this track. Most likely, it wasn't done by someone clueless. It's just that there are some little nuances in there. How else can you figure it out? It's really hard to tell. It's subjective, unless you have monitoring equipment worth a couple million or more. It's really hard to figure this out in a vacuum. So you pick some reference tracks, compare with them, and if your track doesn't really stand out in a bad way, you might not even need to master it at all. You could just turn up the volume, and that's it, everything's fine. But the question comes up when it does stand out. You have to ask yourself, is it standing out because there are some flaws, something objectively sticking out, or does it just have a different color to it? I mean, a different color. Maybe it's saturated in a different way, or its tonal balance is just a little bit different. You need to understand what you're dealing with, because that's the problem with those change people show on YouTube. They tweak a track that has certain initial conditions, but your initial conditions are different. And that's it. It's the same thing. Imagine you get a rotten chicken and try to make soup from it following a recipe. It's not going to help you. It's the same thing here. If something is wrong at the mixing stage, mastering won't really help you much. Or it might help, but it'll mess up the mix so much that you'll end up with something completely unexpected. That's the main idea. And when we are aiming at what we should actually do, we ask ourselves these kinds of questions. It's about loudness, but we have no choice. We're already working on that. These are some real mistakes in the mix that we fix. Or it's about adding color. That very color, that's the hardest part. You have to understand that when you see a compilation and all the tracks sound similar overall, but they've been mixed by different people, That's top-level skill. That's why mastering is difficult. It's not for nothing that people end up there after a very long professional journey. Because, for example, how do most people become mixing engineers? Usually, it's some former musician who then became an arranger. That's the most common path. They used to write music, and then it hit them that you can make music even better if you put some effort into mixing. And they got so into it that they ended up liking it more and eventually moved into that field. But mastering engineers are people who, most often, that's an audience that moved over from mixing to mastering. You can imagine what kind of people these are and how big their ears must be. So, when you watch those TikTok chains about how mastering is done, you need to understand that you're trying to cheaply outsmart a system where people squeeze themselves out, you could say, like from a dropper, to reach that level when they do mastering. And it's not for nothing. Some top-level sound engineer, for example, in America, when it comes to making A-list tracks, so a very professional sound engineer does the mixing, and even though he might be incredibly experienced, he could do the mastering. Trust me, he has the skills for it. But still, the producer of the project says, no, you won't be doing the mastering. Someone else will handle the mastering, and hands off the mastering to another person. You have to understand, this just works. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here. It's not like they're idiots or anything. Why didn't he just go online, look up some chain, and do it that way? Because, again, it's a very individual and complex thing. If you want to do the mastering yourself, well, that's totally fine too. I'm not judging. Lots of people do it themselves. So what should you actually rely on here? Not on chains, but on references. You need to pick relevant references that are high quality, that sound good, maybe even chart-topping, at least in your genre's top charts. Download about 10 of them for yourself. Here's a little life hack for you. Get the Reference 2 program from Audio. The company is called Mastering the Mix. Load all of that in there and work side by side with your reference track. Mastering. Really, side by side. Don't add anything from yourself. In other words, when you're working with the final track, it's not really a super creative stage where you just go wherever your mind takes you. You might end up drifting away from what the market wants. That's why your only compass here is your reference tracks. And if, for example, when you switch, you don't feel any harsh seam, you don't feel any sharp, unpleasant contrast when you scroll down like this in the program. Well, let me show you, for example. So here it is, and you just, boom, switch like this. That's it. And if, when you switch like that, you don't hear an unpleasant seam, then you're good. Just adjust the volume. Maybe you don't even need to use any compressors. Maybe you don't need to EQ anything. But if you have decent, more or less, control and you live side by side with your references like this, then everything's fine. You don't really need these kinds of instructions because, again, they're not mandatory. Some engineers, professionally, some of them get by with just 2 plugins, and that's it. Maybe, for some, like, we once sent a track for mastering in America. By the way, it's not as expensive as you might think, like, oh, you're sending it all the way to America. No, it's actually pretty affordable. It's about $100 because the specialist works for about an hour, just an average studio, and he sends the track back to us. So we listen to it and, yeah, something seems to have changed, but not by much. And we decided to check the loudness. We turned down the volume, and there are basically no changes at all. And he says, I just checked it and realized you don't need anything added. I just boosted the volume for you. Your tonal balance is already fine. Your track blends well with the references, with tracks from the same genre. You don't stand out in a bad way. So basically you just paid me for a check-in for boosting the volume, and that's reasonable, that's normal. So, dear friends, that's how it is. This area is really different from mixing, because a lot of people get confused. Like, if we're using the same gear, it must mean we're just working with a single track. No way. It's a completely different philosophy altogether. Let me tell you about another challenge here. What's the whole point of this process anyway? So, when should you actually do mastering? In what situation? This is the moment when you have to say goodbye to mixing. And now I'm going to tweak just one track, the sum. That moment comes when you've mixed it so well that you have no idea what else to do in mastering. See, that's why you probably need a different specialist here. Someone with different ears, different experience, and a different, let's say, average reference memory for mixes. Because a professional sound engineer delivers a mix of such quality that they have no ideas left for mastering. Basically, they can just raise the limiter and that's it. It's ready to be released. In other words, it's already very high quality. So, imagine there's this powerhouse sound engineer sitting there, and he mixes it so well that all you need to do is raise the limiter and it's ready to go on air. It's not even a matter of improving the quality anymore. Just imagine what kind of experience and what kind of ears you need to have for that, to handle all of that. Mix it to the point where you have no ideas left for what to do in mastering. Then everything will be fine for you. You can just check yourself at high volume. So you keep mixing, mixing, mixing. You think, well, that's probably it. Compare it to a reference track, and you see you're not falling behind. You're not the ugly duckling. You turn up the volume, and everything still holds up fine. It's not clipping much.